So our next speaker is Penny Edwards, our own Penny Edwards, who's associate professor in the South and Southeast Asian Studies Department, and she will be speaking on memory and forgetting in autobiographies of Cambodia and Diaspora.
Thank you, Peng. And as always, I've changed my title.
Oh.
I'll explain why. My paper is called A Time of Gifts Towards a Biography of Imagined Communities. It is the magic of nationalism to turn chance into destiny. This gem, punctuating the complex prose of imagined communities, is one of many examples of Anderson's talent for what I here dub flash diction. And by the same token, it was a chance alchemy of friendships and intellects, as well as Anderson's personal histories of exile and displacement, and a sense of mischief described by one of his peers as a gleefully contrarian spirit that coalesced into the magic of one of the most innovative and widely translated social science books of the late 20th century, Imagined Communities. The book launched Anderson as one of the first social scientists, if not the first. Sociologist Edward Shills had already coined the term imagined collectivities in his work on knowledge networks, to consider the power of the imagination as an engine of social cohesion and political momentum. It was a daring gesture. Writer philosophers were no strangers to the concept, among them Walter Benjamin, whose angel of history Anderson invokes, and whose illuminations he quotes as he sets himself the task of brushing history against the grain. James Baldwin, citing Doris Lessing, has located the roots of color prejudice in an atrophy of the imagination. We see such atrophy in the rabid rhetoric of political extremists on these shores and elsewhere, whose inability to inhabit the lives of others cauterizes empathy and conjures historical blind spots for the predicaments of those born outside a particular cartography or social genealogy. And we see a tandem shrinkage of the imagination in the increasingly prescriptive and restrictive lens of academia that insists on our writing only from within the confines of our own lineage, be it cultural, racial, or national. The complexity of Anderson's own trajectory defied such zoning. When Burmese dissident Min Zin, now completing his PhD in political science at Berkeley, met with Nelson Mandela, the great leader counseled him to look not to memory for the way out of Burma's quagmire under the military junta, but to imagination. Imagination, alongside emotion, is the vehicle through which artists inhabit other lives, places, and voices. If imagination was Anderson's gift, then emotion was a vehicle for his engagement and affinity with Indonesia, the locus parentis of his lifelong scholarly dialogue with Southeast Asia. It was coupled with his gift for languages and a deep appreciation that to understand the world as a place beyond boundaries, one must speak, neither in the master's language, nor in one's mother tongue only, but in other tongues. These gifts, imagination, emotion, language, give Anderson's work an experiential and intuitive dimension, but it was, I suggest, the tyrannies of distance, not proximity, that were pivotal to his imagining of his most celebrated work, Imagined Communities. It is perhaps precisely because of the translatability of this and other of his works outside of Southeast Asian studies that this symposium hails him as the preeminent scholar of Southeast Asia of the 20th and 21st century. I hesitate to frame this talk or my memory of Anderson with that mantra, as to do so, I believe, risks reinforcing a status quo ante that runs the risk of monumentalizing rather than problematizing his legacy. Anderson's legacy is not just theory, but the tools with which he built it: comparisons, lateral thinking, wide reading, depth of field, an open eye and ear. So it is in the spirit of a symposium rather than a memorial service that I engage critically and therefore not uncritically with Anderson's imagined communities. In so doing, I gesture to the place of the parallel paths and songlines that converge to shape memories and the different argots and vocabularies that resist the unisonance of a national anthem or the contours of a monument on a flag, and work against the grain of Cold War models of area studies, and with the contemporary realities, more so perhaps, or more real perhaps, in Oakland/Berkeley than in Ithaca, among Cambodia than Indonesia or Thailand, whose diaspora is comparatively smaller, of plural belongings and longings shaped by human experience and relationships in often fractured transnational landscapes. My talk is an attempt to map the Cambodia coordinates of Anderson's intellectual journey. This may seem futile. Anderson only visited Cambodia once in 1961 before writing Imagined Communities 20 years later in his mid-40s. Despite his long-standing affiliation with and frequent visitations to neighboring Thailand, he apparently did not return to Cambodia for another 47 years until 2008. He never studied Khmer, nor do Cambodian students feature in his dedications. And to my students, American, Indonesian, Thai, Filipino, Malaysian, Burmese, Chinese, Japanese, English, Australian, Dutch, and French, runs that to his 1992 Spectres of Comparison, and yet, on his third trip to Cambodia in 2013, he told my distinguished colleague, Dr. Krishna Uk, that Cambodia had been the inspiration for imagined communities. How so? We find a ready answer in the clash of arms between democratic Kampuchea and Vietnam in 1979. Indeed, it is with this conflict that imagined communities opens. I quote, "The Vietnamese invasion and occupation of Cambodia in December 1978 and January 1979 represented the first large-scale conventional war waged by one revolutionary Marxist regime against another." Much further into the book, several pages are dedicated to the role of Angkor Wat on the Cambodian flag, the 1967 replication of the Bayon Temple as part of Sihanouk's choreography of nation at Phnom Penh's Olympic Stadium, and the invention of the first Khmer keyboard. Despite, or perhaps because of, Anderson's refusal or reluctance to engage in and with subaltern studies and post-colonial studies, at the time, and here, I have a stop because I'm looking at his work up to the spectre of comparisons, and then his further trajectories into Cambodia, to which I return later. Cambodia appears to have held a somewhat subaltern status in Anderson's imagination, alongside and in comparison with Vietnam and Indonesia, which he lauds for their bloody, I quote, "and up to a point successful wars for independence against fading European imperialist powers, unlike Burma, Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, or the Philippines." Within that latter list, he could also later admire Thailand/Siam as a country that had resisted colonialism. Hindsight, of course, is always oversimplifying. It is important to recall that Anderson was simultaneously defining and complicating the field of Southeast Asian studies in a focus on and attention to cultural, political, and linguistic distinction that defied US foreign policy generalizations about Asia and Africa. But there are, I believe, other factors that make Cambodia the pivot of his theory, not despite, but because of his detachment from that country, language, and culture. The sources for my detour are Imagined Communities, Spectre of Comparisons, and Language and Power. I thank Peng Chea for convening this symposium, Sarah Maxim for organizing it, and the following for sharing with me their personal recollections: Ajahn Chanvik Kaset Siri, Dr. Krishna Uk, Mr. Jack Brame, Michelle Ontelm, Ashley Thompson, Anthony Barnett, and David Chandler, as well as my colleagues Jeffrey Hadler and Sylvia Tiwan. I'm also indebted to Sot Paulin's wonderful novel L'Anarchiste and to Kataria deeply felt and superbly articulated reimagining of communities of memory in her elegant new book. from the land of shadows, war, revolution, and the making of the Cambodian diaspora, as Tuparet Lee's forthcoming book on trauma. I regret I have no time here to give any of these works the time and depth they warrant. I take these conversations, rather than my personal recollections of Ben, who acted with great generosity and intellectual acuity, as my supervisor for a Fulbright year in Cornell's Department of Government in 1993 to 94. As the gateway to consider the place and realms of memory that are at once illuminated by imagined communities and yet at the same time resist its aerial mapping of nation through the creation of new communities born of the destruction of the Khmer Rouge genocide that led to that very war between democratic Kampuchea and Vietnam, with which Anderson opens imagined communities. As with my meetings with Ben in his windowless Cornell office some 20 years ago, this conversation with his work has once again provoked a detour, then from a planned PhD on Sino-Cambodian relations to the genealogies of nationalism, today from a planned paper on obituary of nation, via literary, visual, and monumental iterations and negotiations of loss, where or when, in beautiful phrasing, words are injured. And in Sop Paulin's haunting lines written in Paris after learning of the loss of his family in the Khmer Rouge genocide, Je ne vis dans le réel, ni dans l'imaginaire. I neither live in reality or in the imagination. What I offer are perhaps flights of fancy, reflections on Ben's Cambodia journeys, and speculations about the possibilities for imagining nations, that his tandem distance and detachment from Cambodia against the grain not only of history, but of his deep immersion in and identification with Java, enabled in Ben. The idea of nationalisms as imagined and not felt, of identities as constructed and not inherited, was, I suggest, a concept Ben might never have come to had he not been ejected from his terra cognita and first Southeast Asian love, Indonesia. As Anthony Barnett has mooted, Ben was a sort of nationalist with Java and more broadly with all Southeast Asian countries, as the Kayan perspective was that the US was imposing its power on countries that had their own legitimate national differences. By contrast with the deep allure and emotional resonance of Java, the rebus of Angkor on the Cambodian flag was to Ben simply that, rebus, in a time both empty and homogeneous, because it had not been experienced in any depth on his one short stopover in the country. Culture, by extension, remained a close cousin to artifact. It was precisely the detached gaze of a spectator, without affinity or effect in this instance, a gaze rendered all the more flat against the deep undulations of his experiences in Indonesia and later Siam, that allowed Anderson in the early 1980s to see nation as artifact, via the lens of Cambodia. This section is place and displacement. If exile is, as Lord Acton wrote in the 1860s, the nursery of nationality, then serial exiles were also the incubus of the imaginative enterprise of Anderson's scholarship. But this uprootedness also came, perhaps, at the expense of the recognition of those identities that remain firmly anchored in place. In his reflection on long-distance nationalism, 1992, Anderson explicitly speaks from his own experience of exile. How could a boy who learned Czech from his mother, and German from his schooling, not see his Czech as though in exile through the inverted telescope of his German? The inverted telescope figures as a metaphor of estrangement and cultural inversion in Anderson's fragmentary memoir, stitched across introductions to several of his volumes. In the intro to Spectres of Comparisons, he writes of the vertigo he felt at listening to President of Indonesia Sukarno praise Hitler as an extraordinarily clever nationalist, because for the first time in my young life, he writes, I had been invited to see my Europe as through an inverted telescope. Evoking a return to Ireland after a childhood in absentia, the poet Evan Boland writes, what I had lost was not land, but the habit of land, whether of growing out of, or settling back on, or being defined by. The brick pink the brick-pink cheeks she bends to kiss, this land is no terra infirma, no flat flap of a map. It is what grounds both the figure in this poem and much of Boland's poetry. 5 pages into Imagined Communities, Anderson, who spent part of his childhood in California, writes, like Gertrude Stein in The Face of Oakland, one can rather quickly conclude that there is no there. But Stein had indeed known a there in Oakland, as any Oakland resident would, where she lived from 1880 to 91, often taken out of context. Stein's lines from her Everybody's Autobiography, published in 1937, a year after Anderson's birth in Kunming, refer her to her return about 4 decades after leaving Oakland, to find that her childhood home was nowhere to be found. The city had expanded tenfold, and the house she was raised in, with its expansive orchards built over, erased and gone. Anderson is evoking here, in this no-there-ness, not maps or territory, at least not consciously, but rather what he sees of one of 3 paradoxes that have puzzled scholars of nationalism, namely their emptiness, their philosophical poverty, and even incoherence, which can give rise among cosmopolitan and polylingual intellectuals to a certain condescension. Following on from this discussion, Anderson lays out, in an anthropological spirit, the definition of nation, which is the fulcrum of his book, as an imagined political community, one that is imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It was perhaps precisely Anderson's itinerant childhood and adolescence that enabled his detachment or distancing from place/nation-based affect, and the development of his thesis. As Anderson writes in his introduction to Spectres, that book was born of a convergence, Imagined Communities was born of a convergence of fortuities in 1982, a visit by the New Left Review, Anthony Barnett to Cornell to write his book on Vietnam and Cambodia, the encouragement of his brother Perry. As I look back on it now, he wrote in 1990, it seems an odd book to be written by someone born in China, raised in free countries, speaking with an obsolete English accent, carrying an Irish passport, living in America, and devoted to Southeast Asia. Anderson was triply exiled from his birthplace in Kunming, China, from his parental ancestral home of Ireland, and from his adoptive country, Indonesia. Again, he reaped positives from his experience. Exile came at a fortunate moment, he writes, of his expulsion from Indonesia, enumerating 3 benefits. First, it led to his becoming a frequent visitor to, and almost as attached to Siam as Thailand as to Indonesia. Second, exile forced him to think comparatively against the friendly Orientalist grain and to return seriously to the written word, especially literature. I'm going to speak very briefly, because I probably have 2 minutes, about my time teaching Imagined Communities in Cambodia, and with some reflections by Cambodian students and my Thai colleague, Ajahn Chan Vit. So in 2006, I taught Imagined Communities to a class of 16 Cambodian graduate students and junior faculty in a capacity building and higher education program at the Center for Khmer Studies. The session culminated in a field trip by bus from Phnom Penh to Myanmar. Our journey through and across various borders was a mobile classroom that illuminated the conceits of borders and nation. Reading Imagined Communities in Phnom Penh was one thing, but it was the tripwires of the field that drove home the harsh reality of the fictions engendered by nationalism and ossified in immigration checkpoints. For borders only become active when you cross them. I learned this lesson when traveling from west to east by Trans-Siberian Railway to China in 1982, but Ben must have learned it countless times from his youth onwards, via his migrations from east to west and back again. And which of my Cambodian students would not know this, either from their journey from Site 2 refugee camp or elsewhere, or from their journeying in a country scarred by war and checkered with military checkpoints until the end of the Civil War in 1997. We had with us a map of Pailin, a map of Thailand, both like the maps described by Nobel laureate Wisława Szymborska, from whose poem I quote briefly below. Quiet like pins dropping, and in every black pinprick, people keep on living. Mass graves and sudden ruins are out of the picture. Nations' borders are barely visible, as if they wavered to be or not. I like maps because they lie, because they give no access to the vicious truth. The mural stupas and symbols that remain in Pailin are those of kings and Buddhas, absent of the Burmese community, eviscerated by the ethnic nationalism of the Khmer Rouge, by refugee flight, by civil war, their histories painted over. Maps are best unpicked while on the move. I'm going to pass over the sections I wrote about gender, language, and speaking through the reflections of Sok Paulin in Paris, because my time is up, to end with this intimate reflection. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to be rude, because I wanted to honor not only Ben Anderson, but also my colleague Jeffrey Hadler, who is not here and could not be here, and as well as to honor Ajahn Chanvit, who sent an intimate reflection. So one thing, I wrote more about this in here, but I just wanted to say that it's really interesting that Anderson published Imagined Communities in Z Books, a small left-wing press, and he remained loyal to Verso Press. And in an era when so many scholars in Anglophone academia are rewarded for publishing only with particular peer-reviewed academic journals or established academic presses clocked on a hierarchy, Ben lectured and engaged very widely in different scholarly domains. And we see an example of this in the work of my colleague Jeff Hadler, who very much regrets he could not be with us here today, who completed his PhD with Ben, and whose Bender Prize-winning Muslims and Matriarchy, translated as Sengketa Tiada Putus, is now available, open access and a free download. Jeff told me this morning, I don't know if I learned this from Ben, he added, but it was certainly part of the Cornell spirit that our work must be written with a Southeast Asian audience in mind. And so here is one of the legacies that Anderson leaves in a lesson for us all, which is to read beyond your syllabus, think outside the box, travel off the map, embrace difference, engage with diverse communities, not only those that boost your academic CV, salvage the imagination, and write to express, not to impress. In other words, don't let your other tongue perish in the push to publish. I'd close with the intimate reflection by Ajahn Chanvit, who Anderson credited for the gift of a second life, namely the new lease on Southeast Asian scholarship that Thailand offered following Anderson's eviction from Indonesia, that conjures Anderson's ultimate transcendence and defeat of boundaries. Believe it or not, Chanvit wrote, on December the 12th, I was with Prem in Siem Reap. That was when I received an email from Melanie, Ben's sister, saying that he passed away. I cried and told Prem. Prem was quiet. He did not say a word. Prem is my Cambodian colleague who supplied the pictures and was present on two of Ben's visits. That day, they took me halfway to the Tonle Sap. We visited one old Bayan Prasat and the modern Wat there. I walked around and around those many stupas, thinking about erecting one for Ben. But I finally realized that a long time ago, he told me the end of Ibu Claire Holt, the author of Arts in Indonesia. Ben loved her very much. She was the Ibu for him, while George Kayan was the Bapak of the Cornell Modern Indonesia project. Claire was a small, amazing lady from Riga, Latvia. She was in Java during World War II. Another section of my paper was about that and gender. When she passed away in the early 70s, Chanvit writes, her ashes were thrown over the Cayuga Water in Ithaca. Ben said he loved it. So at the end, after the cremation in Surabaya, Ben's ashes were thrown into the Java Sea. Interesting enough, Suharto or his cronies cannot kick Ben Anderson out of Indonesia anymore. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have a couple of papers on a theme that has been mentioned throughout, but these two papers are explicitly on the idea of comparison and will approach it in terms of whether it's a method. So the first speaker is Rebecca Karl, and she is an associate professor of history at New York University.
Thanks so much for inviting me to this, Peng. It's been a learning experience. And I just want to say a disclaimer that I really had very little time to prepare remarks. And so this will be slightly scattered and pretty cursory. So I will yield the rest of my time to whomever else needs it. But I also have to say I did not know Ben Anderson personally. I think I'm probably the only one who's standing here who was invited to this conference who did not know him. I sort of met him once in Taiwan in 2005 when I was at the Academia Sinica for a semester, and he came through at the invitation of his Taiwan Chinese translator, Wu Ruiren. The previous year, I had been at a conference at UCLA, and I'd sat at a dinner next to Perry Anderson, who mentioned to me how much his brother appreciated my work. I said something inarticulately inane, like, oh, I appreciate his too. By 2005, Under Three Flags had just come out. I had not yet had time to read it, but I had heard that Anderson had cited my book, Staging the World, very positively in his book. The fact that Ben Anderson knew my work well enough to mention it to his brother and liked my book well enough to cite it was insanely flattering at the time. I went to his talk in Taiwan, waited around to introduce myself and shake his hand, and just as he acknowledged me and we began to chat, I was pushed aside by other far more insistent admirers. And that was that. As with many in my early 1990s cohort of graduate students, or at least those of us at Duke, I came to Anderson's work through Partha Chatterjee, whose post-colonial critique seemingly turned imagined communities into a bestseller and Anderson into an interdisciplinary planetary academic rock star. I'm pretty certain that was not Partha's intention, and of course it was not his single-handed doing. It was, at Duke, it was really very much Partha's doing, but that was Duke. Clearly, there was and remains a real historical predicate to the reach of Anderson's work and its appeal precisely at that time. Most immediately for the early 1990s, and I'm talking about the second edition, the reissue of 1991 then, when Anderson's book was reissued in its first revised edition. The breakup of the Soviet Union and the reemergence of nationalisms in Eastern Europe and the USSR's former fractions were giving a new life to an ideological and practical social phenomenon that had long been treated by Marxist theory as residual false consciousness and by liberals as a necessary popular ally to modernizing state power. Of course, and in addition, by the 1980s and 90s, the manifest difficulties of nation-states across the post-colonial globe had made the anti-colonial nationalisms of a previous era much less heroic-looking than originally represented. This was a critique rigorously argued by newly christened post-colonial scholars in the First World Academy, if not, of course, by the state actors whose nationalist representativeness was being re-examined. Anderson's book, or I should say its reissue in 1991 following the Chatterjee Challenge and the renewed burst of nationalisms in the world after 1989, forced us then to see nationalism was neither dead, nor was it dying, and nor was it just residual ideological affect. In fact, Anderson forced us to see that nationalism had both never gone away and never been adequately explained to begin with. By hitching nationalism as an emergent hegemonic state form to the project and prospect of imagination in what Peng has called a paradigmatic style, Anderson was able to reanimate and reopen in a new idiom an academic problem of long standing. What is the relation between the state and consciousness? While he does not solve this problem, and of course who could, his approach to the issue, prescient both in its political and scholarly acumen, was to popularize a method, although when I read the LRB extract of his autobiography, he really does disavow comparison as a method. I think of it as a method, however, so I don't care what he says in that regard. But he popularized a method that proclaimed and was founded upon a comparative advantage. That is, he made clear that in scholarship there is an advantage to comparison that names itself as such. And as an historical proposition, he avowed that there is a comparative advantage for those who can look beyond the often presumed but absented Euro-American-centric premises of comparison that characterize much of academic practice in the United States and European academies, as well as in many other places as well. These vantages allowed Anderson to fashion comparisons that spatially decenter histories in the pursuit of advantageously more complex and comprehensive explanatories. Thus, on the one hand, hewing to a time-honored social scientific and area studies bias towards implicit comparison, Anderson's approach is, of course, quite old-fashioned, and his self-narrativization in the London Review of Books makes quite clear how old-fashioned he was in this regard. And yet, in his hands, and on the other hand, the post-colonialism, constructivism, globalization, ethnicisms, religious upsurges, and perhaps most important, his scholarly perspectives on the world from Southeast Asia rather than from Europe and the United States, all combined in new ways and in contradictory and conflictual fashion to turn comparison into a distinctly advantageous, necessary practice that needed to substantiate itself historically and concretely rather than impose itself theoretically and abstractly. In this regard, we can recall that, according to Henri Lefebvre in his essay, What is Modernity? Quote, "We could define modernity as the ghost of revolution, its dispersal and sometimes its caricature. This definition, unquote, this definition would use, quote, the concept of uneven development to the full, unquote," he goes on to say, "a fullness that would grant to the multifariousness of crises, to the very substance of modernity as lived experience, an integrally constitutive role in a, quote, vast process of comparison that would make modernity a precise, applicable concept," unquote. If crisis is the predicate not only of life but of modern comparison, then revolution is the possible and even probable haunting of a present ever lived comparatively by force or violence. In excavating this haunting, Anderson's New Style sociological wager emphasizes the deep connections between modern personhood and national belonging that are occasioned through and actualized in part through revolutionary activities. While the first edition of Anderson's book came out in the same year, I think, as Ernst Gellner's, I think it was 1983, right? And while both continue the Hegelian quest to explain integrative unity, Gellner's old-fashioned sociology remained fixated on the glue of the universalization of education as the essential motor for the efficient and stable economic growth of the state. For Anderson, it was language, or print language, that became key to the creation of an imaginary of national unity, not because of the popularization of education, but because of the logic of book publishing, the novel's narrative form, and the administrative needs of the state. In pointed contrast, then, to the kinship of religious imaginary systems, which were either very limited or limitlessly boundless, print language and the vernacularization culturally produced print language and vernacularization culturally produced the possibility of a national state imagination. This then, of course, could turn nationalism into a comparative concept. And I have a whole critique of this. I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to appreciate it for what it did at the time to open up some avenues of inquiry. The focus on the standardization of a particular language became an enormously compelling argument in the corner of the world and the part of history I usually muck around in, modern China. Indeed, at first, it merely helped reconfirm what most Chinese nationalists wished to hear, that the unification of the Chinese administrative bureaucratic dynastic system through the elite language of Mandarin Chinese, Guanhua, was not only prescient, but in fact modern and nationalist avant la lettre. In this sense, the arrival of Anderson in China studies could be seen as neither revelatory nor ruptural, but rather taken as a sign that Westerners had finally understood the genius of China. And yet, Anderson also made possible some more critical interventions. Modern Chinese historiography of the communist variety from the 1930s until the 1990s often naturalized nationalism by positively conflating it with socialism and the latter's revolutionary forms of unity. In non-PRC scholarship, bourgeois capitalist nationalism was always understood as the obvious teleological endpoint of modern Chinese history, with socialism a temporary insanity to be overcome. And indeed, by the 1990s, the waning of the socialist project brought nationalism roaring back into the scholarly and political and public agenda, not only among nationalist Chinese scholars in Taiwan or those sympathetic to the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party, but among previously Marxian and Maoist scholars in the PRC, whose rejection of the primacy of socialism in China's modern history allowed them to fall back upon the nativist naturalization of nationalism and its now contemporary linkage to bourgeois capitalist modernization. Much of the work in this latter idiom was informed by scholarship on the modernizationist telos, of the particular reading of Sun Yat-sen, engaged by his purported successors in Taiwan, and newly taken up by his liberated admirers in the PRC in the 1990s and beyond. Now, despite this mainstream thrust, thus both the modernization-centered and the bureaucracy Mandarin-centered versions of this history can count as mainstreams of different and yet overlapping types. Despite this, a strain of fresher approaches began to denaturalize nationalism and to subject it to some further inquiry. In tandem, then, with the arrival of Anderson's imaginaries, and indeed often conflated with this topos, a whole cottage industry grew up around discovering, unearthing, and elaborating the invented traditions of modern Chinese nationalism, whether these were said to be organically linked to or rupturally disconnected from something called, I guess, uninvented Chinese tradition or some sort of residual ritual. This kind of scholarly work on the late Qing and Republican Chinese history seems to have worked itself out by now, as every possible invention has been deconstructed for its inventiveness. And yet the disentangling of invention from imagination or imaginaries has rarely been touched, and I'm not going to touch that further. Maybe that's something for a different time. My own work, beginning in the early 1990s and into the 2000s, was clearly part of the Andersonian trend in American academic scholarship, if not on China, then in more general terms. I took a class on theories of nationalism in my first year of graduate school at Duke, although it was taught, that was in 1990, although it was taught at UNC by Craig Calhoun and Lloyd Kramer. We began with Anderson and Chatterjee, moved on to Homi Bhabha, and thence through a selection of the sexiest post-colonial writers then available to historians and social scientists interested in the problem of language and textuality, state form, and culture critique. From that time on, my work came to be powerfully informed by, even as it was also situated in critical dialogue with, Anderson's appeal to a comparative scholarly practice that does not hide itself in implicit Eurocentric standard-bearing, but rather announces itself as the explicitly created and thus globally normative form of modern world history. This normativity, however, cannot be made to appear as an expected set of benchmarks, as with modernization theory, but rather as a contingent outcome of the violence of multi-sided modern encounters occasioned by capitalist expansion and imperialist colonialism. What I recognized in Anderson and what I was most interested in, unlike many of my China studies cohort, was not the modular form, or rather the sociological contents of particular formal inventions such as the modern state or other so-called invented traditions, but rather the textual, linguistic, discursive, and thus historical possibilities opened by a focus on precisely the imaginaries or consciousnesses enabled by not only by the cotemporality created by print media, but by its entwining with the forced co-spatiality of modernity. In this sense, my own focus came to rest upon not only the diachronic temporal problem of historical imaginaries, but on the seemingly accidental and yet historically structured spatial juxtapositionalities that made modern global imaginaries possible and plausible. Here, I followed Anderson's indication on print. In modern China, it was the emergence of print media in the form of newspapers and journals that rendered such necessary accidents visible and conceptually productive for Chinese intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th century. While Anderson's argumentative reliance upon something he calls print capitalism, maybe that universal language that made him legible for many others, is to my mind the most unsatisfactory part of his argument. But nevertheless, it was one could see in the emergence of print media, at least in China, that this incipiently commercialized sphere seems absolutely central to the materialization of a systemically possible and structurally productive set of comparisons. In the China field, however, this got taken into there was a slight detour that happened. Well, not so much a detour. There was a sort of a different route taken. There was perhaps a discussion that didn't happen in Sanjay's terms. Because many in the China field in the 1990s discovered the historical role of the print media not through print capitalism or commercialization of print per se, but through a Habermasian optic, by which they found in the late 19th and early 20th century presence of a vibrant marketplace in journals and newspapers, proof that China had an emergent middle class, just like Germany, with a corresponding public sphere, just like Germany, and thus at least an incipient civil society, just like Germany, whose public opinions were supposedly reflected in the media. All of these sprouts of democratic process, it was said, were resprouted in the 1980s after the Maoist rupture, and then again in the 1990s after the June 4th blip. Of course, recently it's all been quashed and distorted again, but never mind, let the sprouting sprout. This type of adherence to a Habermasian model in order either to prove China's sameness with or difference from Germany or Europe, or the tragic inability of China to be Germany, is, of course, premised precisely on the kind of comparison with which social science and history are most comfortable, the Eurocentric one. Rather than go down that familiar rabbit hole, I took Anderson's lead and concentrated instead on an historical explanation of the creative how of collective consciousness formation. For me, the print media did not reflect some pre-existing public or general social opinion. Instead, print media helped substantiate a new world as a form of language, discourse, conceptualization, and politics. By extension, in taking seriously the juxtapositions of news items in a daily newspaper or weekly journal, I was able to put together an entirely different global structure than the one normally understood to be operative at the time. By bypassing, therefore, the hypothesized and abstract China-West or China-West-Japan comparisons that hegemonically dominate inquiries on modern China to this day, I instead found that the concrete materiality of the news as a form of print arrangement, where you had the Philippine Revolution happening along with the Boer War, happening along with the Cuban Revolution that happened along with many other types of activisms and revolutionary uprisings, so that this very form of print arrangement allowed Chinese intellectuals to imagine the world from the vantage of the central eventfulness of anti-colonial nationalisms around the world at the turn of the 20th century. In identifying China's own task with these would-be nationalist struggles, or what were read as nationalist struggles, because they were always already nationalist in the Chinese reading, Chinese critical of the dynastic state were able to align their own projects in necessary and sympathetic comparison with a global phenomenon that then became both Chinese and worldly at the same time. So in some sense, I did, like Anderson, and as Peng talked about earlier, find in this initial moment of nationalism a utopian global possibility. I think the Chinese did as well. That, of course, utopia was very soon dashed. But it seems to me, in reading these historical moments, these moments of openness, these moments where a different future becomes visible, that we can see how that it becomes clear what the comparative advantage is. In opening the question of imaginaries as a globally necessary process of containment in the modern world, Anderson's work, despite its shortcomings, can be appreciated not only for its scopic range and its empirical depth, but more important for me at least, it can be appreciated for its bold worlding of comparison, without which modernity would remain always already the privilege of the few, and the world could only ever be seen from the perspective of the always already powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker today is Vince Rafael, and he is a professor of history at the University of Washington, and he will speak also on the theme of comparison, contingency and comparison, recalling Benedict Anderson.
This is the toughest role, is to be the last speaker, right? Because everyone's anxious to go, it's been a long day, and in many ways what I have to say isn't really something new because it's already been said, and so all I'm going to do is re-say and restate many of the themes, and so therefore exercise a kind of, so this will be kind of an exercise in translation, as it were, saying things otherwise, but which have already been said. I first met Benedict Anderson in 1979 when I began my graduate work at Cornell. He invited me to his home for dinner some 20 miles from Ithaca in a town improbably called Freeville, once the location of a juvenile detention facility called the George Junior Republic that had been the model for the Iwahig Penal Colony in Palawan Island in the Philippines, in the colonial Philippines. Appropriately enough for Ben, a connoisseur of irony, his home used to be the warden's, who apparently had to leave town hurriedly because of some scandal. This anecdote says something about the Cornell of Ben Anderson, the Cornell that I knew. It was a fertile field for inducing two of the most characteristic aspects of his work, contingency and comparison. Indeed, one grew out of the other. It is this relationship that I would like to talk about, recalling how they figured in Ben's life and works. As I was beginning my dissertation in 1983, in the wake of Ninoy Aquino's assassination, which would then which would be the beginning of the end of Marcos's martial law regime, Ben had just published Imagined Communities. His office was directly below mine in an old house that served as the site for the Modern Indonesia project that many people earlier had mentioned, more commonly known as 102 West Avenue by its denizens. It was a former fraternity house whose members had been kicked out of campus for some transgression, so we were essentially in frat row. The chairs and tables were scarred and stained with cigarette burns and coffee cups. The doors were cracked, the stairs creaked, and parts of the balustrade at times came off as you held on to them. In the summers, frat boys sunbathed on the roofs, held beer balloon wars, and played very loud rock and roll music around us as you were trying to write. Faculty, students, and visiting professors worked in various offices, often late into the night, meeting during evening seminars and weekly brown bags featuring speakers ranging from diplomats to foreign scholars. The basement was full of boxes of file folders, which I always thought were Ben's research notes, turning the place into a veritable fire trap. 102 West Avenue, in short, was an ideal place to work. Its ramshackle quality lent it the feel of a refugee camp, physically precarious, resistant to domestication, but also ripe with insurgent possibilities. At 102, unexpected connections grew into friendships that led people into paths other than what they thought they had embarked on. And its informal atmosphere allowed for explorations of all sorts that deconstructed and deviated from the disciplinary formations that fixed and fixated many of us. Firmly but gently, Ben, sitting in his office, often in his overalls, for those of you who remember, presiding over seminars while smoking his Dutch masters, another ironic touch, asking questions that always surprised and disoriented us, served as the tutelary spirit of 102. One of the things that drew me, and doubtless many others, to Ben was precisely his style of thinking. He readily admitted that he was not a theorist and not really a political scientist. He shied away from the fashionable labels such as post-structuralist or post-colonialist, and the classicist in him, with its love for lexical precision and rhetorical economy, abhorred the theoretical hyperventilation and logorrhea that often plagues the American Academy. More likely, he would have preferred to be called a historian and a novelist, both of which are closely related to one another. As a historian novelist, Ben was drawn to the contingent constellations of people and events, reveling in their surprising and unexpected juxtapositions. All of these generated not only alternative and parallel universe to what had happened, they also opened up doors into worlds that could have happened. In other words, for Ben, thinking entailed recuperating those events and imaginings that had to be repressed in the making of dominant realities. We can see the critical role of contingency in his various autobiographies. For example, in the introduction of Language and Power, which Sanjay and some others have already mentioned, Ben relates how he came to be involved with Southeast Asian studies. It started with a blow in his face. While studying classical languages at Cambridge in 1956, he found himself wandering into a political demonstration held by a small group of South Asians. A fight suddenly broke out, initiated by a group of English students hurling racial epithets at the demonstrators. Ben found himself in the middle trying to stop the fight. Quote, "My spectacles were smacked off my face," he recounts, "and so by chance I joined the column of the assaulted," close quote. The rest of Ben's account consists of tracing the cracks created by such a chance encounter, cracks that lead to more fortuitous meetings and unexpected events. His interest in Asia, stoked by the violent episode, he decided to learn about Indonesia, which had been in the news. He had heard that there were only two places where Indonesia were being seriously studied, Yale and Cornell. Thanks to an old friend, he finds himself he finds a teaching assistantship at Cornell, and there meets his most important mentors, George Cahen, John Eccles, James Siegel, and Claire Holt. Aside from Cahen and Siegel, it is Holt, an art historian, who has a profound effect on Ben, in part because she mirrored his own predicament as an exile many times over, displaced and yet seeming to be at home everywhere. Ben describes himself as, quote, "someone born," and this is a quotation that I think Penny mentioned, "someone born in China, raised in 3 countries, speaking with an obsolete English accent, carrying an Irish passport, living in America, and devoted to Southeast Asia. The author of, quote, an odd book on nationalism that could only be written from various exiles and," this is my favorite, "with divided loyalties," close quote. Claire Holt was the daughter of a wealthy Jewish family from Riga, a dancer in Paris and New York, then the lover of the Dutch scholar William Stutterheim. She had lived in colonial Java in the 1930s, had translated for the U.S. military during the war, and fled the McCarthyism of Washington to Ithaca on the invitation of Cahen to teach courses in Indonesian culture. It was precisely her lack of formal academic training that made her so valued by her students, particularly Ben. Her interests in Javanese mythology, arrived at unintentionally through her wanderings and love affairs, encouraged Ben to think about Indonesian politics differently through the lens of its cultural logics. The result, as many of those in Southeast Asian studies know, has been a series of highly influential essays on politics and culture, and the culture of the Indonesian Revolution and its counter-revolutionary aftermath. Unexpected conjunctions informed, or at least triggered, much of Ben's work. While doing fieldwork in post-revolutionary Indonesia during the early 1960s, his interests were guided by dramatic happenings. Jakarta then was adrift with possibilities, rumors, and contradictions, yet also awash in what appeared to be a genuinely egalitarian ethos. While there, he writes, quote, "I was lucky enough to have 2 remarkably elderly Javanese teachers who were also brothers," close quote, to teach him about, quote, traditional Javanese culture while remaining, quote, woolly sharp-eyed about its delusions. Luck, in this case, also foreshadowed catastrophe. The coup and subsequent massacres of 1965 and 66, which were totally unexpected, both in their extent and viciousness, led to Suharto's dictatorship and the subsequent banning of Ben from Indonesia for having co-authored, as Doug mentioned this morning, a report implicating the regime for its role in the coup and the killings that followed. But again, as luck would have it, Ben's exile from Indonesia coincided with the overthrow of the military dictatorship in Thailand in 1973 and the return to a more open society. Having cultivated close friendships with a number of Thai dissident intellectuals, Ben was given another chance to pursue his interest in Southeast Asian revolutionary movements. And in an even more fortuitous spin of the wheel, his brother Perry Anderson had been editing New Left Review and had authored important comparative works on the history of nation-state formations in Europe. Thanks to the accident of birth, Ben found his intellectual and political horizons shifting again toward more comparative directions. In the midst of repeated displacements and exiles, he finds himself haunted by unsettling questions about solidarity, difference, and imagination, while accompanied by a recurring object of love, the infamous imagined community. The latter, imagined community, is alternately figured as the nation. And I want to emphasize this because I think for Ben, imagined community meant more than just the nation. It was also the family in its most extended forms. It was mentors, colleagues, students, friends from various parts of the world, linked by the generosity and affection of their regard. The imagined community, therefore, was born out of a series of violent mishaps and exiles, contingent meetings and ghostly questions. It's also a community of sentiment. The very title of his famous book on nationalism suggests as much. It was written, as Penny points out, in the midst of a war between two socialist countries, Vietnam and Cambodia, and in response to the debates in the UK about the breakup of Britain. Nationalism had been derided, like religion, as a utopic fantasy by European Marxists and as a useless impediment to globalization by proponents of neoliberalism. Ben returned instead to the conditions of possibility that gave rise to nationalist imaginings, seeking to reconstruct what was at once so compelling and persuasive about its discourse. At the same time, he was less interested in providing a general theory about nationalist formation as he was in demolishing cherished myths about the immemorial and timeless nature that nation-states ascribe to themselves. He argued that nationalism was a kind of substitute for religion. It anticipated revolution, even as it sought to sublimate its destructive force. And I think that's the great tension in that book. The extent to which nationalism, on the one hand, anticipates and grows out of revolution, at the same time domesticates it, and how nationalism substitutes for and displaces religion. It's that caught between religion and revolution that's, I think, a recurring theme in its discussion of nationalism. Emerging from experiences of, quote, Creole pilgrimages, homogeneous empty time, the breakup of sacred communities and the vernacularization of sacred language, thanks to the conjunction of capitalism and print, nationalism could retrospectively be reckoned as a sustained, and I love this word, piratable, right? He kept on insisting, the piratable nature. Nationalism is a piratable project for constructing community amid conditions of anonymity. And of course, that fed into the whole notion of, like, for example, Filipino nationalists as filibusteros, pirates, right? Here is Ben's own self-effacing evaluation of the modest goals and yet surprising reach of his book, despite or perhaps because of its broad comparisons in 2011. Quote, "Fools step in where angels fear to tread. In fact, I've always been surprised at how little severe criticism I got about IC. One reason must have been the fact that I didn't concentrate on any one country or region, so the scale of the theory was super macro. Basically, it was also a very simple idea. Technology plus capitalism plus Tower of Babel equals nationalism. Ha 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 ha." Literally, he says that. Ha 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 ha. I mean, Ben had a wicked sense of humor. This brings us to the other key feature of Ben's work, comparison. For Ben, comparison was less a method as what he called a, quote, discursive strategy. It entailed developing a keen awareness of what he called strangeness and absence, thereby opening oneself up to what he called, borrowing from Jose Rizal, the specter or devil of comparison. The effectiveness of comparisons could be gauged by the surprise they produced, or what Benjamin might call shock effects, catching readers off guard by their unexpected juxtapositions among different sites or longitudinal arc within the same site. How did this discourse of comparison prove so generative? Here's an example. Ben's opening paragraphs to his review of Soledad Locsin's translation of the Noli Me Tangere, quote, "Few countries give the observer a deeper feeling of historical vertigo than the Philippines. Seen from Asia, the armed uprising against Spanish rule of 1896, which triumphed temporarily with the establishment of an independent republic in 1898, makes it the visionary forerunner of all other anti-colonial movements in the region. But, seen from Latin America, it is, with Cuba, the last of the Spanish imperial possessions to have thrown off the yoke, 75 years after the rest. Profoundly marked after 3.5 centuries of Spanish rule by counter-Reformation Catholicism, it was the only colony in the empire where the Spanish language never became widely understood. But it was also the only colony in Asia to have had a university in the 19th century. In the 1890s, barely 3% of the population knew Castilian, but it was Spanish readers. It was Spanish readers and writers who managed to turn movements of resistance to colonial rule from hopeless peasant uprisings into a revolution. Today, thanks to American imperialism and the Philippines' new self-identification as Asian, almost no one other than a few scholars understands the language in which the revolutionary heroes communicated among themselves and with the outside world, to say nothing of the written archive of pre-20th century Philippine history. A virtual lobotomy has taken place. The central figure in the revolutionary generation was Jose Rizal, and this is the last paragraph, and then I'll wrap up. The central figure in the revolutionary generation was Jose Rizal, poet, novelist, ophthalmologist, historian, doctor, polemical essayist, moralist, and political dreamer. So is that punchline. He was born in 1861 into a well-to-do family of mixed Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, Tagalog descent. 5 years after Freud, 4 years after Conrad, 1 year after Chekhov, the same year as Tagore, 5 years before Sun Yat-sen, 3 years before Max Weber, 8 years before Gandhi, and 9 years before Lenin. 35 years later, he was arrested on false charges of inciting Andrés Bonifacio's uprising of 1896 and executed by firing squad composed of native soldiers led by Spanish officers. The execution was carried out in what is now the beautiful Luneta Park, which fronts the shoreline of Manila. On the other side of the world, of the Spanish world, José Martí, the hero of Cuban nationalism, had died in action the previous year. At the same time of Rizal's death, Lenin had just been sentenced to exile in Siberia, Sun Yat-sen had begun organizing for Chinese nationalism outside China, and Gandhi was conducting his early experiments in anti-colonial resistance in South Africa. Close quote. Comparison in Ben's hands was meant to provoke the rethinking of received ideas beyond accepted boundaries. In the passage above, we see how he reintroduces the Philippines to the metropolitan readers of the London Review of Books, then later to middle-class Filipinos and other Southeast Asians, by repositioning it in terms of vast world historical forces. The sense of vertigo he invokes arises from grasping the country's history, emerging from the great historical tides washing over one corner of the globe to the other. Unexpected chain reactions result in unforeseen cascades of change that resonate and reverberate through the archipelago, rippling in turn to other parts of the world. History emerges here as a phantasmagoria of possibilities, inflecting, decentering, and displacing one another. Reading Ben, one begins to feel the Philippines as a tenuous collection of sites ready to come apart, but always to come together in new ways. Similarly, he introduces Rizal as a world historical figure, not the privileged boy from Calamba destined for greatness, but as a repository of an interminably hybrid history, kin to those other great modernists of the world, Freud, Conrad, Chekhov, Sun Yat-sen, and Lenin, among others. In this way, Ben maps Rizal's life within the shifting force fields of the revolutionary 19th century. By deprovincializing Rizal, he recasts him into a cosmopolitan figure whose writings and legacy belong not so much to one country or one people, rather they become part of a common inheritance of the rest of humanity. This, in my opinion, is the basis of Ben's genius. By pursuing such comparisons, or better yet, opening himself up to being possessed by their unexpected ghosts, he leads us to see what is often so obvious and for that reason remains invisible in front of our eyes. His greatness as a scholar and as a teacher lay in his ability to poke and probe underneath layers of mystification and the garbage of half-truths covered over by the habits of intellectual laziness and moral cowardice. At the same time, he was always alert to other possibilities that come through the inverted telescopes of time, seeing the distant connections waiting to be made. Rizal with Multatuli, Isabelo de los Reyes with Malatesta, Sukarno with Hitler, for example. Out of these surprising and contingent relays of rumors, gossip, jokes, novels, poems, testimonies, newspaper articles, government reports, census surveys, these massive and promiscuous mixing of texts and tales, works and lives, Ben led us, cajoled us, prompted and forced us to see the world differently, to imagine yet again the history of futures yet to come. His recent death in Surabaya, Indonesia, continues to be deeply mourned by untold others. As his close friend James Siegel has written, quote, "An obituary conventionally names the deceased's contribution as if they have been laid to rest, to be revived when necessary. Careful readers of Anderson's works will find themselves revived, living members of an organization without a form, joining in unimagined solidarity with others unknown to themselves." Thanks.
Thank you.